You are floating on a small canoe, a tulum, gliding silently through a maze of man-made islands. The air is thick and humid, a gentle warmth that makes the skin feel alive. All around you, the shimmering surface of Lake Texcoco reflects a sky of endless blue, but beneath the surface, a different world is taking shape, a world of mud, reeds, and astonishing ingenuity. The year is 1490, and you are not just a spectator, you are an observer of one of the most remarkable agricultural systems ever conceived, the chinampas of the Aztec Empire. To the casual eye, these rectangular plots of land, separated by narrow canals, might look like a natural phenomenon. But look closer, and you'll see the meticulous hand of the Aztec farmer, or chinampero. This isn't just a garden, it's a living testament to human innovation in the face of an unforgiving environment. Imagine trying to feed a city of over 200,000 people, a population rivaling the largest cities of Europe at the time, like Paris or London, in the middle of a saltwater lake. The challenge was immense, and the solution was brilliant in its simplicity. The process began with the lake itself. The Aztecs, or more accurately, the Mexica people who built their capital of Tenochtitlan on an island in Lake Texcoco, didn't fight the water, they embraced it. The lake was their lifeblood, their fortress, and their most fertile resource. A chinampa wasn't built on solid ground, it was built on a submerged foundation of interwoven branches, reeds, and sticks. It was, in essence, a giant, waterlogged basket. The farmers, working with incredible patience, would weave these underwater foundations, creating a grid of submerged rectangles that would form the base of their floating fields. Once the foundation was laid, the real work began. The canals between the plots served a dual purpose. They were pathways for the canoes, and more importantly, they were a source of incredible, nutrient-rich soil. From the muddy bottom of the canals, the chinamperos would dredge up a thick, black muck, often mixed with decomposing plant matter and organic waste from the city. This wasn't just dirt, it was a potent fertilizer, a magic mud teeming with life. With long-handled tools and bare hands, they would pile this rich silt onto their submerged baskets. Layer after layer, they built up the land, transforming the unstable, watery foundation into a solid, arable plot. The height of a chinampa was a critical detail. The goal was to raise the soil just high enough so that it was above the water's surface, but low enough to absorb moisture through capillary action. This meant that the fields were self-irrigating. The lake, with its constant, gentle flow, provided a perpetual source of water, eliminating the need for complex irrigation systems and making the farmers' lives infinitely simpler. The chinamperos didn't need to worry about droughts, their fields were perpetually moist, a green oasis in a region prone to dry seasons. But the mud wasn't the only building material. The chinamperos would plant fast-growing willow trees, like the ahujode, along the edges of the chinampa. These trees weren't just for decoration, their roots would grow deep, anchoring the floating islands to the lake bottom and to each other, creating a stable, interconnected network of fields. Over time, these trees would create a living wall, a green fence that prevented erosion and provided shade, creating a microclimate perfect for cultivation. Think of the sheer labor involved. This was not a quick, modern process. This was a slow, deliberate act of creation, a constant rhythm of digging, piling, and planting. Every chinampa was a testament to the farmer's strength and skill. But the result was a productivity that modern agriculture still struggles to match. The chinampas were incredibly fertile, allowing for up to 7 harvests a year. Crops like maize, beans, squash, and chili peppers grew in abundance. The Aztecs weren't just surviving, they were thriving. The canals themselves were also an integral part of this ecosystem. They were a source of food, a place where fish and waterfowl flourished, adding protein to the Aztec diet. The chinampa system was a closed loop, an example of sustainable agriculture that was far ahead of its time. Nothing was wasted, the city's waste became fertilizer, the lake's mud became soil, and the water became a constant source of life. The genius of the chinampas lies not in a single invention but in a holistic understanding of the environment. The Aztecs didn't just build farms, they built an entire ecosystem that worked in harmony with the natural world. They turned a problem, a city on a swampy lake, into a massive advantage, a self-sustaining food source that fueled one of the most powerful empires in Mesoamerican history. But as you drift through this watery labyrinth, a deeper question emerges. This incredible feat of engineering was built on a foundation of both skill and something more, a belief system that tied the people to the land, the water, and the gods. The Aztec people were deeply religious, and their gods, especially Tlaloc, the god of rain, and Chicamcotl, the goddess of maize, were central to their lives. The success of the Chinampa system was not just attributed to hard work, it was seen as a divine blessing, a gift from the gods. How did this spiritual belief system intertwine with the practical, day-to-day realities of farming, and what happened when this seemingly perfect harmony was shattered? You have spent a day immersed in the calm, rhythmic world of the Chinamperos. The sun is beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air grows cooler, and the scent of damp earth and growing plants becomes more pronounced. You can hear the distant calls of waterfowl and the gentle splash of a paddle in a nearby canal. As you reflect on the sheer scale of this agricultural feat, you begin to understand that it was not merely a matter of engineering, it was a daily ritual deeply interwoven with the very fabric of Aztec society and spirituality. The spiritual life of the Chinampero was inextricably linked to the land and the water. Every step of the farming process, from the first dredging of the mud to the final harvest, was a sacred act. The Aztecs believed that the earth was a living, breathing entity, a body that required care and respect. This reverence was not a passive belief, it was expressed in constant, practical action. Before beginning a new planting season, a farmer would offer a small sacrifice, perhaps a few drops of their own blood, a pinch of cornmeal, or a prayer, to honor the gods of fertility and rain. This wasn't a grand, public ceremony, it was a personal, quiet moment of gratitude and petition. Tlaloc, the god of rain, was arguably the most important deity for the Chinampa farmers. His favor meant the difference between a bountiful harvest and famine. The Aztecs saw rain not just as water but as a sacred liquid, a manifestation of Tlaloc's will. They built small shrines, or teocallis, on their Chinampas, and made offerings to him to ensure the perpetual moisture of their fields. The intricate system of canals and islands was, in a way, a physical prayer, a testament to their faith that if they worked with nature, the gods would bless their efforts. But the religion was not just about supplication, it was a form of knowledge. The Aztec priests, or Tlamacazqua, were also keen observers of the natural world. They studied the movements of the stars and the patterns of the seasons, creating a complex and accurate calendar. This knowledge was passed down to the farmers, who used it to time their plantings and harvests. They knew exactly when the rainy season would begin, when to expect a dry spell, and how to plan their crop rotation to maximize yields. The spiritual and the scientific were not separate, they were two sides of the same coin, with one informing and enriching the other. The social structure of the Aztec Empire also played a crucial role in the success of the Chinampa system. Land was not individually owned in the modern sense. Instead, it was held by clans or calpulli. Each calpulli was responsible for cultivating a specific area of the lake, and the labor was often communal. Neighbors would work together, sharing tools and knowledge, and helping each other dredge mud or repair the woven foundations. This collaborative spirit created a sense of community and shared purpose. When one family thrived, the entire calpulli benefited. The Chinamperos were considered a vital part of the empire. They were the engine that drove the Aztec economy, producing the food that fed not just the common people but also the powerful nobility, the priests, and the warriors. Their lives, while seemingly mundane, were the very foundation of the society. The daily rhythm of their work, waking with the sun, paddling through the canals, and tending to their crops, was the bedrock upon which the magnificent stone temples and bustling markets of Tenochtitlan were built. Yet, this carefully balanced ecosystem, a perfect blend of human ingenuity, spiritual belief, and social structure, was about to face a challenge it was not designed to withstand. The arrival of the Spanish in the early 16th century brought not just new technologies and diseases, but a fundamentally different worldview. The Spanish saw the land not as a sacred trust, but as a resource to be exploited. They didn't understand the intricate, symbiotic relationship the Aztecs had with their environment. To them, the Chinampas were just fields, a strange and messy way to farm. The Spanish conquest, a cataclysmic event of immense proportions, would shatter the Aztec Empire and forever change the landscape of the Valley of Mexico. The intricate knowledge of the Chinampa system, passed down from generation to generation, would face a threat far greater than any drought or flood. The delicate balance that had sustained an entire civilization for centuries was on the verge of being undone. But how did the Spanish view this system, and what were the immediate consequences for the thousands of people whose lives were anchored to these floating fields? The morning light reveals a different kind of life on Lake Texcoco. The rhythmic dip of the paddle and the quiet work of the Chinamperos have been replaced by the sound of Spanish cannons and the shouts of soldiers. The year is now 1521. Hernán Cortés and his forces, aided by thousands of indigenous allies who resented Aztec rule, have laid siege to Tenochtitlan. The intricate network of Chinampas, which once symbolized the heart of Aztec life, now becomes a strategic liability. The canals, once pathways for commerce and sustenance, are now battlegrounds. Canoes, once laden with corn and squash, are now used to ferry warriors and supplies. The Spanish, accustomed to European warfare, saw the watery landscape as a major obstacle. They had no understanding of how to fight on water, nor did they comprehend the sophisticated agricultural system that lay beneath their feet. To them, the Chinampas were not a marvel of engineering, they were a marshy inconvenience that needed to be conquered. As the siege intensified, the fragile ecosystem began to unravel. The canals were choked with debris, the willow trees were felled for firewood and barricades, and the carefully maintained fields were trampled under the boots of soldiers. The delicate balance was shattered. The final, devastating blow came with the fall of the city. As the Spanish conquered Tenochtitlan, they began to systematically dismantle the Aztec way of life. The Spaniards, eager to assert their dominance and rebuild the city in their own image, began to fill in the canals and level the Chinampas. They introduced new, European agricultural practices, which were ill-suited to the region's unique environment. The communal land ownership system of the Calpulli was replaced by the Spanish encomienda system, which granted large tracts of land to individual Spanish conquistadors. The Chinamperos, who once held a revered place in society, were now treated as forced laborers. Over the next few centuries, the once bountiful Lake Texcoco was slowly and deliberately drained. The Spanish believed the lake was a source of disease and a barrier to easy transportation. They didn't see the lake and the Chinampas as an integrated system, but as a problem to be solved. As the water level receded, the self-irrigating Chinampa system, which relied on the constant moisture from the lake, began to fail. The soil, once rich and fertile, became dry and brittle. The willow trees, deprived of water, withered and died. The vibrant heart of the Aztec Empire, the floating gardens that had sustained a civilization for centuries, began to disappear. However, the story of the Chinampas did not end entirely. In the southern parts of the Valley of Mexico, in the villages of Xochimilco and Mixquic, some of the Chinampas survived. These communities, less accessible to the Spanish and more reliant on their traditional way of life, managed to preserve a fragment of the ancient system. To this day, you can still see and visit these remaining Chinampas, a testament to the resilience of a people and their unique agricultural heritage. They stand as a living museum, a quiet reminder of a time when mud and water were transformed into a vibrant, self-sustaining paradise. The story of the Chinampas is more than just a historical footnote about a clever farming technique. It is a powerful lesson about the clash of worldviews. The Aztec approach was one of harmony and adaptation, a belief that humanity's success lay in working with, not against, the natural world. They saw the lake as a partner, a source of life. The Spanish, in contrast, viewed nature as something to be controlled and dominated, a resource to be tamed and exploited. This difference in philosophy ultimately led to the destruction of a unique and highly sustainable agricultural system. Today, as we grapple with the challenges of climate change, sustainable food production, and urbanization, the Chinampas offer a profound and timely reflection. They remind us that some of the most enduring solutions to our modern problems may not lie in grand technological leaps, but in a return to the simple, patient, and deeply rooted wisdom of the past. The Aztecs built a garden on a lake, not by conquering it, but by listening to it, and perhaps, that is the most valuable lesson of all. You are standing on a quiet street in the small, unassuming town of Canton, Ohio, in the sweltering summer of 1883. The air is heavy not just with humidity, but with a palpable sense of unease. This isn't the kind of tension that precedes a bank robbery or a political uprising. It's something far more peculiar and deeply unsettling. The source of the town's anxiety is a creature both common and essential to daily life, the pig. For years, these animals had been a fixture of urban existence in America, wandering freely, acting as a kind of organic sanitation system by scavenging for discarded food scraps. But by the late 19th century, with cities growing and notions of public health evolving, the long-standing truce between humans and hogs was about to be broken. The conflict had been brewing for decades. Pigs were everywhere. They roamed the streets of major cities like New York and Cincinnati, rooting through garbage, clogging thoroughfares, and generally being a nuisance. While they were tolerated as a practical solution for waste disposal, their presence was increasingly seen as a sign of backwardness and filth. The push for modernization and sanitation began to gain momentum, and cities across the country started passing ordinances to ban free-roaming livestock. In Canton, a city on the cusp of industrial growth, the debate over the city's porcine population had become a hot-button issue, pitting a new generation of reformers against those who clung to the old ways. The Canton City Council had finally taken a stand. In a landmark decision, they passed a new ordinance: no more free-roaming pigs. From a certain date, any pig found wandering the streets would be considered a public nuisance and would be dealt with accordingly. This was a radical change, an unprecedented shift in the relationship between man and animal. The announcement was met with a mix of relief from the reformers and outrage from the hog owners. Many of these pigs were a family's primary source of meat and income. The ban wasn't just a matter of public hygiene, it was an economic blow to the working class. As the deadline approached, the city was divided. The newspapers were filled with angry letters from both sides. One editorial praised the council for sweeping away the four-legged filth, while another decried the move as an attack on the honest man's livelihood. The tension was so thick you could almost see it. The farmers and hog owners, many of whom lived on the outskirts of town, had to either pen their animals or sell them off. The problem was, there simply wasn't enough space or infrastructure to contain the thousands of pigs that were about to become outlaws. On the day the ordinance went into effect, the scene was one of surreal chaos. The streets, once filled with the meandering grunts of hogs, were now patrolled by city officials and law enforcement. The first pigs to be captured were a few strays, easily caught and impounded. But as the days wore on, the situation escalated. Hog owners, desperate to protect their property, began to hide their animals. They built makeshift pens in their backyards, shooed them into basements, and even tried to smuggle them out of town under the cover of darkness. This was a slow-motion conflict, a creeping sense of inevitability that something was about to break. The tipping point came with the pork panic of 1883. Faced with a backlog of captured animals and mounting public pressure, the city council made a fateful decision. They issued a final order: all impounded hogs were to be disposed of. The language was intentionally vague, but the meaning was clear. The city's official response was not to find new homes for the animals, but to exterminate them. The sheer, logistical nightmare of this plan was what made it so remarkable and, in a strange way, so emblematic of the era. The city had no modern slaughtering facilities for such an operation, so the disposal would have to be carried out in the most basic and brutal way possible. What began as a municipal dispute over sanitation had spiraled into something far more dramatic, a testament to the friction between progress and tradition. The town was about to witness an event that would be etched into its local history as a macabre, almost unbelievable spectacle. But how did the city officials plan to carry out this grim task, and what would be the surprising consequences of their actions? The decision had been made, and the grim task of disposing of the impounded hogs was about to begin. The city of Canton, Ohio, was about to face a logistical and moral quandary that had no easy solution. The city officials, likely with no prior experience in such a macabre endeavor, designated a vacant lot on the outskirts of town as the site for the operation. Word spread quickly through the community, and an eerie silence fell over the streets. The grunts and squeals of pigs, once a constant backdrop, were replaced by a tense anticipation. The chosen method was a study in grim pragmatism. It was not a high-tech or even a humane process by modern standards. It was simply an act of mass extermination. The plan was to use a combination of bludgeons, knives, and even a few crude firearms. It was a chaotic, disorganized affair. The city had no trained slaughtermen for this task, so they relied on a motley crew of hired hands and police officers. The air, already heavy with the August heat, was soon filled with the terrible sounds of the slaughter. The city, which had just passed an ordinance to become more civilized, was now engaged in a profoundly uncivilized act. The spectacle was not without witnesses. Curious, and perhaps morbidly fascinated, citizens gathered at a distance to watch the spectacle. The scene was a stark contrast to the quiet, dignified town that Canton aspired to be. It was messy, it was brutal, and it was a public relations disaster in the making. The very thing the city had sought to eliminate, filth and chaos, was now being created on a massive scale. The bodies of the pigs piled up, and the stench became unbearable. The city had solved one problem, the free-roaming pigs, only to create a far more immediate and visceral one. But the story of the Great Pig Massacre was not just about the grim act itself, it was about the unexpected consequences that followed. The city had no plan for the remains. The pile of pig carcasses, now a rotting, fly-infested mound, became a public health crisis far worse than the one the city had tried to solve. The local authorities had to scramble to find a solution, eventually resorting to a mass burial in a field, an act that further polluted the land and the groundwater. The pork panic had become an environmental and public health nightmare. However, amidst the chaos, a new form of resistance emerged. The pig owners, heartbroken and outraged by the city's actions, began to fight back. They formed a loose coalition, filing lawsuits against the city and staging protests. They argued that the city had not only destroyed their property but had done so in a cruel and barbaric manner. This was no longer just a sanitation issue, it had become a moral and legal one. The case made its way through the local courts, gaining national attention and sparking a debate about individual property rights versus public good. The incident was a turning point for Canton and for many other American cities. It forced a reckoning with the realities of urbanization. People began to realize that the old ways of life, where animals and humans coexisted in a messy, semi-rural fashion, were no longer viable. The Great Pig Massacre, in its own gruesome way, accelerated the need for modern infrastructure, from organized sanitation departments to dedicated slaughterhouses. The event, which seemed like a minor local incident at the time, became a catalyst for change. But the ultimate legal and social impact of the pig's demise was yet to be seen. What did the courts decide, and how did this bizarre event ultimately shape the future of American cities and the way we view our relationship with the animals in our lives? The aftermath of the Great Pig Massacre was far from quiet. The piles of carcasses and the lingering stench had been dealt with, but the public outrage and the legal battle had just begun. The lawsuits filed by the pig owners against the city of Canton, Ohio, became a test case for the evolving relationship between urban living and individual rights. The plaintiffs argued that the city's ordinance was not only a violation of their property but that the subsequent disposal was an act of extreme cruelty and negligence. The defense, representing the city, countered that the health and well-being of the collective public superseded the rights of individual property owners to keep livestock in an unsanitary manner. The legal proceedings were widely followed, and the case became a symbol of the broader national debate about the future of American cities. The courts ultimately sided with the city, ruling that the municipal government had the authority to enforce public health ordinances, even if it meant infringing upon traditional property rights. However, the ruling was not a complete victory for the city. The courts also criticized the city's barbaric method of disposal, suggesting that while the ban was legal, the execution of the policy was not. This legal ambiguity forced a change in how cities would handle similar issues in the future. The most significant and lasting impact of the Great Pig Massacre was not in the courtroom, but in the realm of public policy and infrastructure. The event served as a macabre but powerful catalyst for change. It highlighted the urgent need for a more organized and sanitary approach to urban life. In the years following the incident, Canton, like many other cities across the country, invested heavily in public sanitation. They established dedicated sanitation departments, created centralized waste management systems, and built modern slaughterhouses on the outskirts of town, far from residential areas. The old practice of relying on free-roaming animals for waste disposal became a thing of the past. The Great Pig Massacre, for all its strangeness and tragedy, was a key moment in the history of urban development. It was a clear, if gruesome, example of the growing pains of a nation transitioning from a rural, agrarian society to an industrial, urban one. It forced people to confront the consequences of living in close proximity and to accept that individual freedoms sometimes had to be curtailed for the good of the community. The humble, wandering pig, once a silent partner in the daily life of American towns, became a symbol of a past that could no longer be sustained. Today, we take for granted our clean streets and organized waste management. We don't have to worry about pigs wandering into our yards or rooting through our garbage. The story of the Canton Pig Massacre seems like a strange, distant historical oddity. Yet, it serves as a powerful reminder of the hidden battles and minor historical events that shape the world we live in. It shows us that even the most boring or seemingly insignificant details of daily life, like what happens to a pig in a small Ohio town, can have a profound and lasting impact on the course of history. You are standing at the edge of a Roman construction site, not in the bustling heart of Rome, but in the quiet, dusty hills of the Italian countryside. The year is approximately 144 BC. The air is filled with the sounds of hammers, chisels, and the low murmur of men at work. You are not looking at a gladiator arena or a grand temple, you are observing the slow, meticulous, and profoundly unglamorous work of building the Aqua Marcia, one of the most significant engineering marvels of the ancient world. While history often remembers the Caesars and the generals, the true story of Rome's aqueducts is a tale of the ordinary men who made them a reality, the surveyors, the stonecutters, and the humble laborers. The construction of an aqueduct was an undertaking of staggering scale. The Aqua Marcia, for instance, would stretch over 91 kilometers, about 57 miles, from its source in the hills to the heart of Rome. Its purpose was simple: to bring a constant supply of fresh, clean water to a city of 1 million people. But the process of building it was anything but simple. It was a painstaking, multi-generational project that relied on a level of precision and coordination that seems almost impossible for the era. The first and most critical role belonged to the agrimensors, the Roman surveyors. These men were the unsung heroes of the entire operation. They possessed a knowledge of geometry and land measurement that was essential for success. Using a tool called a groma and a device called a chorobates, they had to ensure a continuous and perfectly level gradient. The aqueduct could not be too steep, or the water would flow too fast, damaging the masonry. It could not be too flat, or the water would stagnate. The ideal slope was a delicate balance, often just a few inches of drop over hundreds of feet. The agrimensors would spend months, even years, meticulously mapping the terrain, navigating valleys, and charting a course through solid rock. Their calculations, often done on wax tablets, were the blueprint for the entire project. Once the course was plotted, the laborers took over. These were not slaves in the typical sense, but often a mix of skilled craftsmen, paid workers, and legionary soldiers on engineering duty. Their work was grueling. The construction of an aqueduct was a perpetual rhythm of digging, quarrying, and building. In the mountains, they had to carve tunnels through solid rock. The process was slow and dangerous. They would use iron chisels and hammers to chip away at the stone, sometimes setting fires to heat the rock and then dousing it with cold water to crack it. The work was done by hand, inch by painful inch, in the oppressive darkness and dust. In the valleys and open plains, the work was different but no less demanding. Here, the famous arches were built. These structures, so iconic today, were not just for show, they were a pragmatic solution to a challenging problem. The Romans had to maintain a constant gradient over uneven terrain. Building a massive stone bridge was often the only way to carry the water channel across a valley. The construction of an arch was a precise, team effort. It required masons to cut and shape the individual stones, or voussoirs, and then a team of laborers to lift and set them into place, all guided by a master builder. The temporary wooden frameworks, called centering, that held the arch in place until the keystone was set, were a feat of carpentry in themselves. The channel for the water, known as the spicus, was another vital component. It was a semi-enclosed canal, lined with a special waterproof concrete called opus signinum. This concrete was a marvel of Roman ingenuity, made from a mixture of lime, sand, and crushed ceramic or brick. The lining was essential to prevent leaks and to keep the water pure. The application was done by hand, a sticky, messy job that required patience and skill to ensure a seamless, watertight finish. The daily work was a series of simple, repetitive tasks, but it was these small, boring actions that, when repeated thousands of times by thousands of men, created an infrastructure that would last for centuries. The story of the Roman aqueducts is not one of a single brilliant moment of invention, but of the slow, methodical application of known principles. It was a testament to human resilience and the power of collective, coordinated labor. But what happened when these intricate systems failed, and what did the daily maintenance of these massive structures look like in a city of over 1 million people? The aqueduct was not just a marvel of construction, it was a living, breathing system that required constant vigilance. Once the water began to flow, the work of the engineers and builders was far from over. It simply transitioned from construction to maintenance. The daily life of the Roman water manager, or curator aquarum, was a world of tedious but essential detail. Their job was to ensure a continuous and pure flow of water to Rome, a task that was as much about problem solving as it was about management. The greatest enemy of an aqueduct was not time, but the natural world. Debris, such as leaves, branches, and soil, would constantly clog the channels. The mineral deposits from the water, primarily calcium carbonate, would build up over time, narrowing the spicus and reducing the water flow. The curator aquarum and their team of specialized workers, known as aquarii, would spend their days walking the length of the aqueducts, inspecting every inch for cracks, leaks, and blockages. This was a slow, deliberate process, often conducted in the dark, damp confines of the underground sections. The tools of the aquarii were simple: trowels, picks, shovels, and long rods to clear debris. Their work was one of constant repair and cleaning. They would chip away at the mineral buildup, patch small cracks with opus signinum, and remove any foreign objects that had found their way into the channel. It was a dirty, thankless job, but it was absolutely critical to the city's health. A single leak could not only waste a precious resource but also undermine the stability of the entire structure. A major blockage could cut off the water supply to an entire district of Rome, causing immense hardship. But the challenges were not just technical, they were also social. The Roman water system was a valuable and highly regulated resource. The curator aquarum had to deal with the constant problem of illegal diversions. Wealthy citizens or powerful landowners would sometimes tap into the aqueduct lines to divert water to their private villas or farms without permission. This was a serious offense, and the aquarii acted as a kind of water police, identifying and punishing these illegal connections. The job required a keen eye for detail and the courage to stand up to some of the most powerful people in the empire. The management of the water itself was a complex system. The curator aquarum had to decide which of Rome's 11 aqueducts would supply which part of the city and for what purpose. Water was allocated for public fountains, private homes, baths, and even for industrial purposes. This wasn't a free-for-all, it was a carefully planned distribution system designed to serve the needs of a diverse population. The curator would use a series of sluice gates and pipes to control the flow, ensuring that everyone got their fair share. The quiet, daily work of these men, the slow walk along the channel, the careful clearing of debris, the repair of a small crack, was the very thing that kept Rome alive and thriving. It was a testament to the power of routine maintenance and the long-term thinking that was a hallmark of Roman engineering. Without the persistent, unsung efforts of the aquarii, the magnificent arches and grand fountains would have been nothing more than dry, useless monuments. But what happened when a major aqueduct failed, and how did the Romans recover from a citywide water crisis? When a major aqueduct failed, it was a moment of urban crisis. The Roman water system was so vast and interconnected that a failure in one section could have ripple effects throughout the city. The most common catastrophic failure was a breach in the main channel, often caused by a natural disaster like an earthquake or a flood. When this happened, the meticulous, daily work of the Aquarii was replaced by a coordinated, citywide effort to restore the flow. The response was not a chaotic panic, but a testament to the Romans' organizational skill and their deep understanding of engineering. The first step was an immediate assessment of the damage. A team of engineers and surveyors would be dispatched to the site of the breach. They had to quickly determine the scale of the failure and the best way to repair it. This required a combination of theoretical knowledge and practical experience. They would measure the extent of the damage, calculate the necessary materials, and devise a plan to temporarily divert the water flow if possible. The workers would then race against the clock, as every day without a fully functioning aqueduct meant a city on the verge of a water shortage. The repair work itself was a feat of rapid construction. The Aquarii and other laborers would work in shifts, around the clock if necessary, to rebuild the damaged section. This often involved building temporary wooden scaffolding, clearing away the rubble, and then meticulously rebuilding the masonry and the waterproof channel. The work was dangerous and exhausting. They had to move massive stones, mix large quantities of cement, and work at height, all under immense pressure. The success of these emergency repairs was a direct result of the Roman Empire's ability to mobilize large groups of skilled and semi-skilled labor for public works projects. However, the consequences of a water shortage were not just logistical, they were deeply social and political. The Roman populace relied on the public fountains, or castella, for their daily water. When a major aqueduct went down, the water supply to these fountains would dwindle, leading to long lines and public frustration. The city's elaborate bathhouses, a central part of Roman social life, would have to be closed. The failure of the water system was a visible reminder of the fragility of urban life, and the emperor or city officials who oversaw the repairs were keenly aware of the need to act quickly to avoid public unrest. The story of the Roman aqueducts, therefore, is not just one of grand arches and impressive engineering. It is also a story of routine, of dirt under fingernails, and of a relentless, daily commitment to maintenance and repair. It's a story of how a society's most remarkable achievements are built and sustained not by genius alone, but by the slow, steady work of ordinary people. The genius of the Romans wasn't just in knowing how to build a channel to carry water, it was in their ability to organize, manage, and maintain that channel for centuries. The aqueducts were not just a marvel of the past, they are a timeless lesson in the importance of mundane but necessary labor. The legacy of the Roman Aquarii and the Curator Aquarum lives on in our modern infrastructure. The systems we rely on today, our water lines, our power grids, our transportation networks, all require constant, often invisible, maintenance. The challenges they face are not so different from those faced by the Romans: leaks, blockages, and the constant need for repair. The Roman aqueducts, in their beautiful, silent arches, stand as a monument not just to a great empire, but to the dignity and necessity of the daily grind. You are in Amsterdam in the year 1636, a city of bustling canals, gabled houses, and merchants whose ships ply the seas of the known world. The air is thick with the scent of salty water, fresh baked bread, and something else, the intoxicating aroma of a strange new obsession. The streets are not filled with the clamor of war or the debates of philosophers, but with the hushed, feverish whispers of men talking about flowers. Not just any flowers, but tulips, and not just the tulips themselves, but their broken bulbs, those that display a fiery mix of colors. This is the heart of what history will remember as tulip mania, but the story of why it happened is far more complicated and far more boring than you might think. The tulip, a native of the Ottoman Empire, had been introduced to Europe in the late 16th century. It was an exotic, rare flower, a luxury item for the wealthy. But a peculiar natural phenomenon transformed it from a simple status symbol into a subject of wild speculation. Some bulbs, infected with a non-lethal virus, would produce broken flowers, petals with intricate, fiery patterns of streaks and feathers. These were not just beautiful, they were unique, and their appearance was unpredictable. The rarity and mystery of these broken tulips, such as the famous Semper Augustus with its scarlet flames on a white background, made them incredibly desirable. By the early 1630s, the demand for these bulbs began to outstrip the supply, and their prices started to climb. But this wasn't just a simple case of supply and demand. The economic and social conditions of the Dutch Republic at the time created the perfect tinder for this speculative fire. The Netherlands was a newly independent and immensely wealthy nation. Its merchants were bringing in vast fortunes from global trade, and there was an abundance of liquid capital with few places to invest it. The traditional safe havens for money were real estate or government bonds, which offered low returns. The tulip market, with its promise of quick and astronomical profits, seemed like a thrilling alternative. The craze was not just driven by the rich, it was a democratic fever that swept across all classes of society. The market expanded beyond rare, broken bulbs. Speculators, many of whom had no interest in gardening, began trading in regular, common tulip bulbs as well. The prices rose steadily, then exponentially. A single bulb of a desirable variety could be worth as much as a house in Amsterdam. People began to sell off their land, their businesses, and even their furniture to buy more bulbs. The market was a whirlwind of activity, but it was built on something far less tangible than a flower. It was built on a new and complex financial instrument, the wind handle, or wind trade. This is where the story gets truly boring but incredibly significant. The majority of the transactions were not for physical bulbs at all. They were for contracts to buy or sell bulbs at a future date. A trader would buy a contract for a dozen bulbs in the spring, hoping the price would rise by the time the bulbs were physically available. This was a form of futures trading, a sophisticated financial mechanism that had no place in the world of simple horticulture. People were trading on promises, on expectations, on the belief that the price would always go up. They were, in essence, buying and selling nothing but hot air. The tulip market became a self-perpetuating bubble. As prices rose, more people were drawn in, convinced that they couldn't lose. The risk seemed minimal, and the rewards were unimaginable. A sailor could trade his ship for a single bulb and, in his mind, become a wealthy man overnight. But what happens when a market is based on nothing but a collective belief in its own infinite growth, and what seemingly minor event could be the pin that pricks this fragile, beautiful bubble? The tulip market's upward trajectory seemed unstoppable. By early 1637, the fever had reached its peak. The prices were so astronomical that it was no longer possible to make any meaningful calculations of value. A single viceroy bulb, one of the most sought-after varieties, was supposedly traded for a list of goods that included 2 loads of wheat, 4 loads of rye, 4 oxen, 8 pigs, 12 sheep, a bed, a suit of clothes, a silver drinking cup, and 1,000 pounds of cheese. The entire transaction was a complex form of barter, a testament to the fact that the actual value of a tulip bulb had become completely detached from reality. The trade was no longer about a beautiful flower, it was a bizarre game of financial musical chairs. This feverish speculation was built on a fragile foundation of credit and promises. Many people had not bought their bulbs with cash but had taken out loans against their homes or businesses, expecting to repay the debt with a fraction of their future profits. Others were trading in those wind handle contracts, betting that the prices would continue to rise indefinitely. But a market based on the belief in endless growth is inherently unstable. It needs a constant influx of new buyers to keep the prices inflated. The moment that influx slows, the entire structure is at risk of collapse. The beginning of the end was as mundane as the beginning of the craze. In February 1637, a seemingly insignificant event occurred. At a routine tulip auction in Haarlem, a city that was a major hub for the trade, a few bulbs failed to sell. This was not a catastrophe, but it was a crack in the facade of infinite demand. The buyers, who had grown accustomed to a guaranteed sale and ever-increasing prices, paused. The price of a common tulip variety, which had been rising steadily, suddenly stalled. Then, it dropped. The news spread quickly, and the collective confidence that had fueled the mania began to evaporate. The fall was swift and brutal. The people who had been so eager to buy contracts for future bulbs were now just as desperate to sell them. But there were no buyers. The win-handle market, which had existed on the promise of future value, imploded. The value of the tulip bulbs plummeted. Within weeks, prices had fallen to a fraction of what they had been at the peak. The beautiful, variegated Semper Augustus was no longer a symbol of immense wealth. It was just a flower bulb, and a surprisingly common one at that. The social and economic consequences were devastating. Many people, from wealthy merchants to humble shoemakers, were left with worthless contracts and immense debt. The panic and ruin were widespread. The Dutch government, caught off guard by the speed of the collapse, tried to intervene. They attempted to enforce contracts, but the courts were overwhelmed with lawsuits. Ultimately, they made a decision that, in effect, rendered many of the contracts unenforceable. This created even more chaos, as people had no legal recourse to collect their debts. The tulip mania was a cautionary tale, but its legacy was more complex than a simple story of greed and folly. It was a symptom of a larger historical shift. It was the first time in modern history that a speculative bubble on such a massive scale had formed and burst. It was not a crisis of scarcity or a political upheaval, it was a crisis of perception, a moment when a collective delusion took hold of an entire society. The Dutch, a people known for their pragmatism and diligence, had fallen prey to an irrational mania. But what were the lasting economic and social lessons learned from this episode, and how did it influence the development of modern financial markets? The collapse of the tulip market left a trail of financial and emotional devastation, but its legacy was far more profound than the shattered dreams of speculators. The tulip mania served as a brutal, real-world experiment in market psychology and the dangers of speculative bubbles. It was not just about the flower, it was about the birth of a modern financial market and the realization of its inherent risks. Before this, the concept of a market built on intangible future value was largely theoretical. After the bust, it was a very real and painful lesson that would influence economic thought for centuries. One of the most immediate and boring but crucial outcomes was in the legal and financial sphere. The Dutch government and courts, overwhelmed by the crisis, were forced to grapple with the new phenomenon of futures contracts. Their decision to render many of these contracts unenforceable, while chaotic in the short term, eventually led to the development of new, more regulated financial instruments and a more cautious approach to credit. The incident showed that a free-for-all market, left unchecked, could collapse under its own weight, causing widespread social and economic disruption. It was an early argument for the need for regulation and a clear legal framework to govern financial speculation. The social impact was equally significant. The tulip mania became a morality tale. Writers, painters, and philosophers of the era seized on the story as a warning against the twin sins of greed and irrationality. The craze was depicted as a sign of human folly, a moment when a nation renowned for its Calvinist practicality and hard work was seduced by the promise of easy money. This cultural reflection on the incident became a part of the Dutch national consciousness, contributing to a reputation for financial prudence that would last for centuries. It was a painful but necessary lesson in the distinction between real, tangible wealth created by trade and industry, and the illusory wealth created by pure speculation. The tulip mania also provided a blueprint for understanding future financial bubbles. Economists and historians now recognize that the pattern of rapid price increase, a peak of irrational exuberance, and a sudden, devastating crash, is a recurring phenomenon. From the South Sea bubble in 18th century Britain to the dot-com bubble of the late 20th century, the anatomy of a speculative mania remains remarkably similar. The story of the tulips, therefore, is not just a historical curiosity, it is a foundational case study in financial history. It taught us that the fundamental value of an asset can become completely detached from its market price, a concept now known as a speculative bubble. In the end, the Dutch tulip craze was not just about a flower. It was a crucible where the old, mercantile world met the new, abstract world of finance. It was a slow, deliberate lesson, paid for in lost fortunes and broken lives, that a market is not just a place to buy and sell goods. It is a social and psychological construct, one that can be as volatile and unpredictable as human nature itself. The beautiful, patterned tulips, once a source of wealth, became a quiet, enduring symbol of the dangers of collective delusion. You are standing on a frozen river in the year 1683. But this is no ordinary river, it is the River Thames, the very artery of London, now a solid, unmoving sheet of ice. The city's famous bridges, like London Bridge with its bustling houses and shops, are silent. Below them, a new, temporary world has sprung into existence. This is not a scene of cold or hardship, but one of joyous celebration and commerce, a frost fair. The spectacle is so bizarre, so alien to our modern understanding of London, that it feels almost like a dream. But it was a very real, and surprisingly frequent, part of 17th century life. The event was triggered by what is now known as the Little Ice Age, a period of extended cooling that lasted from the 14th to the 19th centuries. Winters in England were far more severe than they are today. The Thames, a wide and relatively slow-moving river, would freeze over completely, often for weeks at a time. This was not a quick process. The ice would build up slowly, first in a thin, fragile layer, then in a thick, solid mass capable of supporting thousands of people. The freezing was a slow, deliberate process, a quiet victory of nature over the city's relentless flow. The moment the ice was declared safe, the city's entrepreneurs and common folk rushed onto the frozen surface. The first to arrive were the Thames watermen, who, with their boats made useless, transformed their trade into a kind of ice taxi service, guiding people from bank to bank. But they were quickly followed by a motley crew of vendors, entertainers, and opportunists. What began as a practical solution to a frozen river quickly became an organized, albeit chaotic, festival. The frost fairs were not a single, spontaneous event, they were a recurring, multi-week phenomenon that punctuated life in London. The fairgrounds were a marvel of temporary infrastructure. Booths and stalls were set up on the ice, selling everything from hot drinks and gingerbread to books and souvenirs. The most famous souvenirs were small metal or paper cards, often with a simple inscription like "Printed on the Thames, January 1684. These were printed on the ice itself, a unique memento of an extraordinary time. The vendors were not just professional merchants, they were also ordinary people seizing a unique economic opportunity. A baker might set up a stall to sell bread, a shoemaker might offer repairs, and a group of musicians might play for tips. The atmosphere was a unique blend of carnival and practicality. People went about their daily business, but on a frozen river. You could walk from one side of London to the other on the Thames, a feat that would be impossible today. People played sports on the ice, from a form of football to a rough-and-tumble version of hockey. They skated and slid, and in one of the most remarkable acts of the fair, they even roasted an ox over an open fire. The smell of the roasting meat, the sound of laughter, and the sight of thousands of people moving on a frozen river created a sensory experience that was unlike anything else in London. The frost fairs were not just a display of human resilience, they were a unique social equalizer. The frozen Thames was one of the few places in London where all classes, from the wealthy nobility to the common laborer, mingled freely. On the ice, the strict social hierarchies of the city seemed to melt away. Everyone was simply a person on a frozen river, enjoying a rare and fleeting moment of shared humanity. But what happened when the thaw began, and what was the quiet, subtle danger that lay beneath the festive surface? The joy and commerce of the frost fairs were always temporary, a brief suspension of London's normal rhythm. But beneath the festive surface, the frozen Thames held a subtle and ever-present danger. As the days grew longer and the sun's warmth returned, the seemingly solid ice began a slow, deliberate process of decay. It didn't melt all at once, it would begin to crack and shift, often with a low groan that went unnoticed amidst the merriment. The Thames watermen, who were experts on the river's currents, were the first to sense the coming thaw. They would look for subtle changes in the ice's texture and listen for the telltale sounds of shifting flows. The danger wasn't just in the surface becoming thin. The tide still moved beneath the ice, albeit more slowly. As the tide shifted, large, dangerous cracks could open up without warning. What seemed like a solid, stable surface could suddenly become a death trap. The most perilous moments were at night, when the light was dim and the festivities had thinned out. A careless step in the dark could lead to a plunge into the icy water below, a situation that was almost always fatal. The fun of the Frost Fair was always a balancing act against the quiet, unforgiving power of nature. The inevitable thaw was a moment of a different kind of chaos. Once the ice was deemed unsafe, officials would try to clear the fairgrounds, but the lure of one last moment of fun or commerce was often too strong. The ice wouldn't melt evenly, large sheets would break away and float downstream, often carrying with them stalls and, in some tragic cases, people who had lingered too long. The final dissolution of the ice was a chaotic, spectacular event. The massive sheets of frozen water would slam into the piers of the London Bridge, creating a deafening crunch and sending shivers through the entire structure. The river, once a playground, became a destructive force, a reminder that its natural state was one of constant flow. The recurring phenomenon of the Frost Fairs had a profound, if subtle, impact on the daily life of Londoners. It was a disruption that was both a hardship and a blessing. On one hand, it paralyzed river traffic, the city's main mode of transport and commerce. Goods could not be moved, and the docks sat idle. This caused economic hardship for the thousands of people who relied on the river for their livelihood. On the other hand, the fairs were a form of shared experience and release. They brought people together in a way that the rigid social structures of the time rarely allowed. They were a communal holiday, a moment of fleeting joy in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. The last Great Frost Fair was in 1814. After that, the climate began to warm, and the Thames, now dredged and more heavily channeled, never froze over in the same way again. The memory of the fairs lingered, however, passed down through generations as a kind of folk history. They became a symbol of a different London, a city that was closer to nature, more vulnerable to its whims, and perhaps, in some small way, more communal. The story of the Frost Fairs is not one of a single great event but of a recurring pattern, a beautiful and dangerous rhythm that once defined winter in the great city. What do these events tell us about the relationship between a city and its environment, and how did a simple climate shift change the social fabric of London forever? The last Great Frost Fair of 1814 marked a silent but significant turning point in London's history. The changing climate, a gradual shift out of the Little Ice Age, meant that the Thames would never freeze over in the same way again. But this wasn't the only reason for the end of the Frost Fairs. The city itself was changing. In the years that followed, engineers began to dredge and widen the river, and the construction of new bridges with more efficient arches allowed for a faster, stronger current. These engineering projects, while improving commerce and navigation, also made it far more difficult for the river to freeze solid. The slow, patient rhythm of a natural phenomenon was being replaced by the fast, efficient pace of industrial life. The cessation of the Frost Fairs had a profound, long-term impact on the social fabric of London. The fairs, for all their chaos and danger, had provided a unique social outlet. They were a communal space where the strict social order of the time was temporarily suspended. Without the recurring freeze, London's social life became more stratified. The public spaces were no longer on a shared, frozen river, but in parks, theaters, and taverns, each with its own specific social rules and clientele. The shared, democratic experience of the fair was gone, replaced by more defined and separate social spheres. The city, in a sense, lost a bit of its soul, a ritual that had brought its people together, if only for a few weeks. The story of the Great London Frost Fairs is not one of a single great event but of a slow, quiet change. It's a lesson about the subtle interplay between a city and its environment. London, for centuries, was a city that lived in a fragile balance with the Thames. The river was a source of life and a means of commerce, but it was also a force of nature that could paralyze the city. The Frost Fairs were the human response to this natural rhythm. They were a testament to the fact that for all our ingenuity, we are still a part of the natural world, and our daily lives are shaped by its quiet, and often boring, processes. Today, when we look at the Thames, we see a clean, well-managed waterway. It is a testament to the engineering and public health efforts of the last 2 centuries. but the memory of the frost fairs serves as a quiet reminder of a different time, a time when a major metropolis could be brought to a halt by a simple shift in temperature. It shows us that our modern, controlled environment is the result of countless small, deliberate acts, like dredging a river or building a new bridge, that add up to a profound transformation. The story of the frost fairs is a powerful reflection on how climate, infrastructure, and culture are inextricably linked, and how the end of a seemingly insignificant historical event can fundamentally change the character of a city. You are standing on a remote, windswept rock in the middle of a churning sea, a place of constant wind and the relentless crash of waves. The year is 1875, and you are about to step into the lonely and meticulous world of a Victorian lighthouse keeper. This is not a life of swashbuckling adventure or dramatic rescues. It is a life of boring but essential routine, a slow and steady rhythm dictated by the sun and the tides. While the public saw the lighthouse as a solitary beacon of hope, the reality for the man inside was a world of quiet diligence, a life defined by the mundane tasks that kept the light burning. The job of a lighthouse keeper was a unique blend of isolation and responsibility. You were one of the few people on Earth whose entire existence was dedicated to a single, repetitive task: keeping a light on. The day began not with the sun, but with the darkness. As dusk approached, the keeper would begin the long, careful process of preparing the lamp. This was a complex operation. The lamp was often a massive piece of machinery, powered by a sophisticated oil-burning system. It had to be meticulously cleaned, the wicks trimmed, and the oil reservoirs filled. A single speck of soot could dim the light, and a single mistake could lead to a catastrophic failure. The light itself was a marvel of Victorian engineering. The Fresnel lens, a series of concentric glass rings that magnified the light, had to be polished to a perfect, gleaming shine. This was a daily ritual. The keeper would climb the long, spiraling staircase to the lantern room, the glass and brass reflecting the last of the daylight. With a soft cloth and a special polish, he would wipe away every speck of dust, every fingerprint, every trace of the day. This was not a quick task. It was a slow, meditative process, a moment of quiet communion with the machine that was his life's purpose. But the light was not the only thing that needed attention. The machinery that made the lens rotate was a network of gears and pulleys, often powered by a heavy weight that had to be wound by hand, much like an old grandfather clock. The keeper would have to wind this mechanism every few hours, a steady, repetitive motion that was the heartbeat of the lighthouse. The sound of the gears turning was a constant companion, a mechanical hum that provided a backdrop to the solitude. The life of a lighthouse keeper was one of immense sensory deprivation. The constant roar of the sea and the wind was an overwhelming sound, a white noise that could drive a man to distraction. But there was also a kind of peace in it, a sense of being completely removed from the noise and chaos of the world. The keeper's only contact with the outside world was a periodic supply boat and, in some cases, a telegraph line. His world was the light, the sea, and the unyielding rhythm of his duty. But what happened when a storm hit, and what was the subtle psychological toll of such a solitary existence? The solitude of the lighthouse keeper was not just a physical state, it was a profound psychological one. While the work was routine and predictable, the environment was anything but. The lighthouse was a tiny, fragile outpost against the immense and often violent power of the sea. The arrival of a storm was a moment of immense drama, a terrifying assault on the senses. The wind would howl like a living creature, and the waves, crashing against the rock, would send spray high into the air, sometimes even reaching the lantern room at the very top. The entire structure would shake and groan, a symphony of a building under siege. In these moments, the boring routine was set aside for a desperate, life-or-death vigilance. The keeper had to be constantly on guard, watching for any sign of a malfunction. A single loose screw, a tiny crack in the glass, a flicker in the lamp's flame, any of these could spell disaster for a passing ship. The keepers learned to read the rhythm of the storm, to understand when the wind was at its strongest and when to expect the next wave to hit. They were not just tending a light, they were a living part of the warning system, a human sensor. The light was their only connection to the outside world, a silent conversation with the ships they could not see, but whose lives depended on their diligence. Beyond the drama of the storms, the everyday solitude had its own insidious toll. The lack of human contact, the endless repetition of tasks, and the constant roar of the sea could lead to a psychological state known as lighthouse madness. This wasn't a recognized medical condition at the time, but its symptoms were well documented. Keepers would begin to experience hallucinations, paranoia, and a profound sense of loneliness. They would talk to themselves, to the birds, and even to the light itself. The stories of keepers going mad were common, and they were a quiet, unspoken reality of the job. To combat the madness, keepers developed their own personal rituals and routines. They would read books, write in journals, and meticulously tend to their gardens, if the location allowed. Some took up hobbies like carving or knitting. These were not just pastimes, they were a way of maintaining a connection to their own humanity, a way of creating a small, ordered world inside the larger, chaotic one. Their daily reports, which meticulously detailed everything from the amount of oil consumed to the weather conditions, were not just a log of work, they were a lifeline, a way of communicating their sanity and existence to the mainland. The Victorian lighthouse keeper was a unique kind of hero. He was not a man of great battles or grand speeches. He was a man of quiet, unwavering duty. His heroism lay in his ability to endure the slow, grinding loneliness and the subtle dangers of his profession. The stories of these keepers are not about dramatic rescues but about the everyday resilience required to keep a light on in a world of darkness. But what was the final fate of these unsung heroes, and how did a new and unexpected technology finally bring an end to their quiet, solitary lives? The quiet, lonely world of the Victorian lighthouse keeper was destined to change, not with a bang, but with the slow, steady march of technological progress. The job, which had been a solitary and human-centric endeavor for centuries, would be quietly rendered obsolete by the very same forces that had given it birth, science and engineering. The end for the lighthouse keeper did not come with a single invention, but with a series of incremental, boring innovations that slowly but surely replaced human hands and eyes with automated machinery. The first major blow to the human element was the incandescent light bulb. While oil lamps were a brilliant technology for their time, they were messy, difficult to maintain, and required constant human oversight. The electric light, which began to be installed in some lighthouses in the late 19th century, was a far more reliable and efficient source of illumination. It didn't need wicks trimmed or oil reservoirs filled, it simply needed a power source. This single change eliminated the most fundamental and time-consuming part of a keeper's daily routine. The new lights were brighter, more consistent, and required far less effort to maintain. The next great innovation was the automated fog signal. For years, keepers had been responsible for sounding a foghorn or ringing a bell during bad weather. This was a grueling, often deafening task that required them to stand watch and manually operate the signal. The introduction of automated, compressed air foghorns, and later, electronic sirens, removed the human element from this critical safety function. The signal was now tied to a sensor that would automatically activate when a certain level of fog was detected. The keeper's role was reduced to a simple maintenance check, a far cry from the constant vigilance once required. The final and most decisive step toward automation was the photoelectric cell. Developed in the early 20th century, this simple device was a silent revolution. It could detect the level of ambient light and automatically turn the lighthouse lamp on at dusk and off at dawn. This eliminated the need for a keeper to be present during the most critical times of the day. The light no longer required a human to light its flame, it now thought for itself. This simple but profound innovation marked the beginning of the end for the profession. Lighthouses began to be retrofitted with these automated systems, and the need for a resident keeper became a thing of the past. By the mid-20th century, the role of the lighthouse keeper was largely ceremonial. The job, which once required a mix of mechanical skill, resilience, and quiet courage, was now reduced to that of a technician who occasionally visited the light to perform maintenance. The final, poignant moments for the last keepers were not dramatic rescues or battles against the elements, but a simple, quiet departure from the rock they had called home. The light, which had once been a testament to human vigilance, now stood as a monument to human ingenuity and the slow, inevitable creep of progress. The story of the lighthouse keeper is a powerful reflection on the human cost of automation. It reminds us that progress, while often beneficial, can also erase a way of life, a set of skills, and a unique form of quiet heroism. The silent, blinking lights that guide ships today are not just a feat of technology, they are also a monument to the forgotten men who once kept the light burning, not with a machine, but with their own unwavering spirit. You are in a cramped, sun-baked room in the city of Thebes, a city of grand temples and colossal statues. The year is around 1350 BC, and you are observing a world that is far removed from the dramatic, monumental image of ancient Egypt we hold in our minds. You are not with the pharaohs or the priests, you are with a scribe, a man whose life is a series of quiet, meticulous tasks that form the very backbone of a civilization. The story of the Egyptian scribe is not one of grandeur, but of the mundane, essential work that kept a vast and complex society running. The life of a scribe was one of privilege, but also one of immense routine and discipline. The path to becoming a scribe began at a young age, typically around 5 or 6. A boy would be taken from his family and sent to a house of life, a school attached to a temple. The curriculum was unforgiving and the discipline was harsh. The primary task was to learn hieroglyphs, a complex writing system of thousands of characters. The student would spend years copying texts, memorizing symbols, and mastering the art of writing on papyrus with a reed pen. This was a slow, deliberate, and often painful process, but it was the key to a life of influence and comfort. The scribe's toolkit was simple but essential. It consisted of a wooden palette, which held cakes of black and red ink, a small pot of water, and a set of reed brushes. The black ink, made from soot mixed with gum and water, was used for the main text. The red ink, made from ochre, was used to mark new sections, highlight important words, or correct mistakes. The papyrus, a fragile and expensive material, had to be used with the utmost care. A single mistake could ruin a roll, and a ruined roll was a waste of a precious resource. The daily work of a scribe was incredibly varied. He could be a record keeper for a temple, meticulously documenting grain harvests and animal sacrifices. He could be a government official, writing laws and decrees from the pharaoh. He could be a court reporter, transcribing the testimony of a witness in a legal proceeding. Or he could be a simple letter writer for the illiterate, penning heartfelt messages for families separated by distance. The scribe was the memory of the state, the voice of the government, and the keeper of all knowledge. The scribe's life was a quiet, contemplative one. His days were spent hunched over a papyrus roll, his pen moving with a slow, steady rhythm. The work was demanding on the eyes and the back, but it was a life of great dignity. Unlike the farmer or the laborer, the scribe was exempt from manual labor and military service. He was a part of the educated elite, a member of a small, powerful brotherhood. His value lay not in his physical strength but in his intellectual skill, a skill that was as essential to the functioning of Egypt as the waters of the Nile. Yet, for all the privilege and importance, the scribe's daily existence was defined by a series of repetitive and seemingly insignificant tasks. The careful grinding of pigment for ink, the slow unrolling of papyrus, the meticulous copying of a long list of figures, these were the boring, day-to-day actions that built a civilization. But what happened when a scribe's work wasn't just about documentation, but about creation? How did the act of writing go from a simple record to a form of magic, and what was the quiet, but powerful, force that lay behind every written word in ancient Egypt? The life of a scribe was one of intellectual rigor, but his role in ancient Egyptian society went far beyond simple record-keeping. The Egyptians believed that the written word was not merely a tool for communication, it was a form of magic, a powerful force that could shape reality itself. This belief transformed the mundane act of writing into a sacred and creative ritual. The gods themselves were believed to have a special connection to writing, with Thoth, the god of knowledge and wisdom, being the patron deity of all scribes. This spiritual dimension imbued the scribe's daily work with a profound sense of purpose. The most powerful form of this magical writing was the creation of religious texts and spells. A scribe was responsible for transcribing the sacred texts that would accompany the deceased on their journey to the afterlife, such as the famous Book of the Dead. He had to be meticulously accurate, as a single misplaced hieroglyph or a wrongly drawn symbol could doom the soul's journey. The scribe's careful hand was not just recording a ritual, it was performing one. He was literally helping to secure a person's eternal existence. This task was one of the highest forms of his craft, a solemn duty that required immense skill and concentration. But the scribe's magic was not reserved only for the afterlife. In daily life, he was a key figure in every legal and administrative transaction. When a farmer sold his land, a scribe would write the contract, a process that was seen as making the transaction real and binding. When a pharaoh issued a decree, the scribe's careful transcription of the words on stone or papyrus was what gave the law its authority and power. The written word was the law, and the scribe was its master. His work, therefore, was not just about documentation, it was about the creation of reality itself, a quiet, powerful act that shaped the lives of everyone around him. The tools of the scribe also held symbolic importance. The palette with its 2 cakes of ink, one black and one red, was a symbol of his trade and was often buried with him in his tomb. The red ink was particularly significant. It was used to write the names of dangerous deities, mark the beginning of a new chapter, or to highlight a negative word. It was a color of power and warning. The very act of choosing which color to use was a small but significant moment of decision, a way for the scribe to add a layer of meaning and emphasis to his work. Despite his high status, the scribe's daily life was filled with what we would consider boring details. He had to be an expert in accounting, calculating taxes and grain yields with incredible precision. He had to be a master of bureaucracy, keeping track of complex family lineages and land ownership records. His work was a quiet, relentless assault on chaos and a determined effort to impose order on a complex society. He was the human spreadsheet, the living library, and the legal repository of the state. Yet, this system of profound reliance on the written word had a single, powerful weakness. What happened to a society whose entire legal, religious, and administrative system was held in the minds and hands of a small, literate elite? How did this concentration of knowledge affect the average Egyptian, and what would happen when this carefully guarded tradition faced an unexpected threat? The scribe's position as a keeper of knowledge was the source of his immense power, but it was also the great vulnerability of the Egyptian civilization. The entire legal, religious, and administrative system rested on a single, fragile foundation, the literate elite. For the vast majority of Egyptians, who were farmers, laborers, or soldiers, the written word was a closed book. They could not read or write, and they were forced to rely on scribes for every transaction, every legal dispute, and every communication. The scribe was not just a professional, he was a gatekeeper, and his monopoly on knowledge was a subtle but powerful form of control. This concentration of power meant that a disruption to the scribal class could have catastrophic consequences for the entire empire. The most significant of these disruptions came not from a foreign invasion or a political coup, but from a quiet, internal shift. The Demotic script, a new, more simplified form of writing, began to emerge. Unlike the complex and artistic hieroglyphs, Demotic was a faster, more practical script for everyday use. Its emergence threatened to democratize writing, making it more accessible to people outside the traditional scribal class. This was a slow and boring revolution, but its implications were profound. The scribes, who had for centuries held a monopoly on knowledge, resisted this change. They clung to the traditional hieroglyphs, which they saw as a sacred and a superior form of writing. They argued that the new script lacked the spiritual depth and artistic beauty of the old ways. This resistance was not merely a matter of tradition, it was a matter of preserving their social standing and their power. However, the practical advantages of the new script were undeniable, and it slowly began to gain favor in daily life, especially for business and legal documents. The scribes, once the sole arbiters of the written word, found themselves in a quiet struggle to maintain their relevance. The final, decisive blow to the scribal tradition came not from a new script, but from a new religion. The spread of Christianity and later, Islam, fundamentally changed the religious landscape of Egypt. The gods and beliefs that had given hieroglyphs their magical and spiritual significance were replaced by new deities and a new form of worship. The old temples, the houses of life, where scribal traditions had been passed down for millennia, fell into disuse. The careful, disciplined training that had sustained the scribal class for centuries was no longer necessary. The art of hieroglyphic writing, once a living part of the culture, slowly faded into a forgotten language. The story of the Egyptian scribe is a powerful lesson in the quiet, uncelebrated ways that a civilization can change. It reminds us that the most significant shifts are often not in the dramatic rise and fall of empires, but in the slow, methodical decay of a single profession or the subtle shift in a cultural belief. The scribes, for all their power and prestige, were ultimately undone not by a warrior's sword, but by a new alphabet and a new faith. Their legacy, once written on the walls of tombs and temples, now lies in the hands of historians and archaeologists who have spent decades trying to unravel the mysteries of a language that was once the very soul of a civilization. You are in a vast, echoing hall in the Forbidden City, the heart of the Chinese Empire. The year is the late 14th century, and the first emperor of the Ming dynasty has recently ascended to the throne. The air is cool and dusty, filled with the rustle of paper and the quiet scratching of brushes on silk. This is the world of the Ming bureaucrats, a class of men whose lives were defined by a relentless and meticulous pursuit of order. While history often focuses on the emperors and their grand decrees, the true power of the empire lay in the hands of these anonymous, diligent record keepers. Their story is a lesson in how a civilization is built and sustained not by grand gestures, but by the accumulation of a million small, boring details. The Chinese bureaucracy, a system of civil administration that had been refined over centuries, reached its zenith during the Ming dynasty. The foundation of this system was the imperial examination, a grueling and highly competitive series of tests that could take a man his entire life to pass. It was a meritocratic system, at least in theory, that allowed a talented commoner to rise to a position of power and influence. But the exam was not a test of military skill or artistic talent, it was a test of memory and literary prowess. The entire system was designed to find and reward men who were masters of the written word and the meticulous art of record keeping. Once a man passed the exam, his life became a blur of administrative routine. The bureaucracy was a vast, multi-layered machine, with different departments responsible for everything from grain taxation to military logistics. The Ming bureaucrats were the human cogs in this machine. Their daily work was a slow, deliberate rhythm of counting, writing, and organizing. They would spend their days hunched over desks, meticulously copying official documents, calculating tax revenues, and drafting reports. The process was one of quiet diligence, a stark contrast to the dramatic political intrigues of the imperial court. The tools of their trade were simple but essential: a brush, an inkstick, an inkstone, and a ream of paper or a roll of silk. The inkstick, a solid block of compressed soot and animal glue, had to be ground on the inkstone with a few drops of water, a meditative process that marked the beginning of every workday. The ink had to be just the right consistency, not too thick, not too thin, to ensure a clear, consistent line. The brushwork itself was a skill that took years to master. Every character had to be perfect, every line straight, and every document free of error. A single mistake could have serious consequences, from a miscalculated tax to a misinterpreted military order. The life of a Ming bureaucrat was one of immense personal sacrifice. The job often required them to live far from their families for years at a time, and the pressure to perform was immense. But the rewards were significant. They were a part of the educated elite, a class of men who held real power, even if they were far from the emperor's ear. Their quiet, diligent work was what held the vast Ming Empire together, ensuring the flow of goods, the enforcement of laws, and the collection of taxes. But what happened when this meticulous, paper-based system failed, and what was the subtle human cost of this relentless pursuit of administrative perfection? The meticulous record-keeping of the Ming dynasty was more than just an administrative tool, it was the very foundation of social control and economic stability. The system, while built on paper and ink, had a very real and tangible impact on the lives of millions of people. Every grain of rice, every bolt of silk, and every penny of tax revenue was accounted for. The Ming bureaucrats were the human memory of the state, a living database that tracked everything from military logistics to the personal land holdings of a peasant family in a remote village. Their work, though boring, was what ensured the empire could feed its armies, build its public works, and collect the taxes that funded the imperial court. This relentless focus on detail, however, had a subtle but profound human cost. The pressure on the bureaucrats was immense. The system was designed to be perfect, but humans are inherently fallible. A single miscalculation could lead to an audit, a demotion, or even a public flogging. The work was so demanding that it often led to health problems, with many officials suffering from eye strain, back pain, and mental exhaustion. The life of a Ming bureaucrat was a paradox, a position of immense power and dignity, but also one of crushing, unyielding pressure. The pursuit of administrative perfection came at the cost of personal well-being. The most interesting and boring aspect of this system was its reliance on paper. The Ming dynasty was a world awash in paper. The government consumed vast quantities of it for reports, edicts, and tax records. The invention of mass-produced paper was a key component of this bureaucratic state. Without a cheap and consistent supply of paper, such a detailed and widespread administrative system would have been impossible. The story of the Ming bureaucracy is, in a way, also the story of paper itself, a humble invention that enabled a vast and powerful empire to be governed with a level of detail that was unprecedented in the world at the time. Yet, this reliance on paper and the written word also created a new kind of vulnerability. Unlike a digital database, a paper record could be lost, damaged, or intentionally altered. The Ming government, for all its meticulousness, was not immune to corruption. A clever bureaucrat could manipulate the records, hide tax revenue, or create false documents to enrich himself. The system was a powerful tool for governance, but it was also a powerful tool for deceit. The quiet, repetitive work of a Ming record keeper was a constant struggle not just against human error, but against human dishonesty. The legacy of the Ming bureaucracy is not just in the thousands of documents that survived, but in the enduring Chinese tradition of civil service and meticulous record-keeping. The system, for all its flaws, created a stable and long-lasting empire that was held together not by military force alone, but by the quiet power of administration. But what happened when this seemingly perfect system faced a crisis it was not designed to handle? How did the Ming bureaucracy, a world of paper and ink, deal with the rise of a new threat that was beyond the reach of its meticulous record-keeping? The meticulous, paper-based world of the Ming bureaucracy was a powerful tool for maintaining internal order, but it proved to be ill-suited for a crisis it could not understand or quantify, a series of devastating epidemics. In the late Ming dynasty, from the 1630s to the 1640s, a series of plagues swept through China. These were not minor outbreaks, they were massive, population-decimating events that would ultimately contribute to the dynasty's collapse. The bureaucrats, who were masters of counting grain and calculating taxes, were at a complete loss. They had no system for tracking the spread of disease, no protocol for quarantine, and no way to quantify a crisis that was a matter of life and death, not of ledgers and accounts. The bureaucracy's response was, in a word, predictable. Faced with a problem they could not solve, they doubled down on what they knew. They continued to demand tax revenue from provinces that were ravaged by plague. They wrote reports about the economic fallout, but they had no framework for understanding the human cost. The records, for all their detail, were silent on the suffering. They tracked the number of dead bodies, not the number of grieving families. The meticulous, boring system that had held the empire together for centuries became a cold, bureaucratic barrier that prevented a compassionate and effective response. The crisis of the plague revealed a fundamental flaw in the Ming system, its inability to adapt to a non-administrative problem. The bureaucrats were trained to deal with problems that could be solved with a brush and a scroll. They could mobilize armies, collect taxes, and build public works. But they could not fight an invisible enemy that moved faster than their reports could be written. The plague was not a matter of miscalculation, it was a matter of life and death, a reality that the bureaucracy was simply not equipped to handle. The failure of the Ming dynasty, therefore, was not just a political or military one, it was, in a very real sense, a bureaucratic one. The very system that had made the empire so strong was also what made it so brittle in the face of an existential threat. The legacy of the Ming bureaucrats is a powerful lesson in the limitations of even the most sophisticated systems. It shows us that a civilization's strength lies not just in its ability to impose order, but in its ability to adapt to chaos. The Ming Empire, for all its meticulous records and detailed accounts, ultimately collapsed not from a single enemy, but from a problem that was beyond its administrative grasp. The story of these unsung record keepers is a quiet but profound reminder that the most significant events in history are often shaped by the mundane, uncelebrated work of the people who were simply trying to make sense of their world, one scroll at a time. You are standing on a narrow, winding road high in the Andes Mountains. The air is thin and cold, and a vast, breathtaking landscape of snow-capped peaks and deep valleys stretches out before you. The year is around 1500, and you are on the Capac Nan, the great Inca road system. What you are witnessing is not a single road, but a network of over 40,000 kilometers, 25,000 miles, of meticulously constructed pathways, all built without the use of a single wheel. The story of this road system is not one of dramatic, monumental engineering, but of a slow, boring, and intensely pragmatic solution to one of the most challenging geographical problems on Earth. The Inca Empire, or Tawantinsuyu, was a vast and diverse civilization, stretching along the spine of the Andes from modern-day Ecuador to Chile. Its greatest challenge was communication and control. How do you govern an empire so immense, with such a varied terrain, from a central city like Cusco? The answer was the Capac Nan. This wasn't a Roman road, built for marching legions and chariots. It was a network of footpaths and stairways, designed for a people who relied on their own 2 feet and the sure-footed llama. The construction of the Capac Nan was a testament to the Incas' understanding of their environment. They didn't try to build a single, straight road. Instead, they built a system of pathways that followed the natural contours of the land. In the coastal deserts, the road was a simple, flat path. But in the steep, unforgiving Andes, the road became a series of ingenious solutions. Where the mountains were too steep, they built staircases out of stone. Where the valleys were too wide, they built suspension bridges woven from grass, a material that was strong and flexible enough to withstand the immense pressure of the wind. The labor behind this monumental project was organized through a system called the MITA. This was a form of public service, a mandatory labor tax that every able-bodied person had to pay. It wasn't slavery, it was a communal duty. The people would work on the roads for a few months a year, building sections that ran through their territory. This decentralized system of construction meant that the roads were a collaborative effort, a kind of national project that every person contributed to. The Incas had no written language in the traditional sense, so the plans for the road system were not on paper but were held in the minds of the master builders and communicated through a system of knotted ropes called quipu. The daily work of the MITA was a slow, deliberate rhythm of moving rocks, carving stones, and weeding grasses. There were no metal tools for heavy lifting, so they relied on simple stone hammers and wedges. They would use immense human force to roll boulders into place and chip away at the mountainside, inch by agonizing inch. The work was physically grueling, but it was also a source of great pride. The roads were seen as a symbol of the empire's power and its ability to overcome the challenges of its environment. But what was the purpose of this immense road system, and what did the daily rhythm of life on the Capac Nan look like? The Capac Nan was more than just a road, it was the nervous system of the Inca Empire. Its purpose was not for commerce or private travel, but for state business. The daily rhythm of life on the road was defined by a constant, quiet flow of official couriers, government officials, and military units. The most remarkable of these were the chasquis, the Incas' royal messengers. These men, chosen for their physical endurance, ran in a relay system, carrying messages and small goods across the immense empire. They would run from one tambo, or rest station, to the next, a distance of about 15 to 20 kilometers, and pass their message to the next runner. This system was so efficient that a message could travel over 240 kilometers in a single day, a feat that rivaled and often surpassed the speed of communication in contemporary Europe. The tambos were the humble but essential service stations of the road system. They were a simple network of small stone buildings, strategically placed a day's walk apart. They provided the Chasques and other travelers with food, water, and a place to rest. They also served as a kind of bureaucratic hub, with officials stationed there to record the flow of goods and people. The quipu masters, or quipukamaics, would use their knotted ropes to record the contents of a shipment, the number of soldiers passing through, or the size of a harvest. The roads, therefore, were not just physical pathways, they were a part of a complex, data-driven system of imperial control. The Kapaknan also played a crucial role in military logistics. The Inca Empire had no draft animals or wheeled vehicles, so every soldier and every piece of equipment had to be transported on foot. The roads, with their strategically placed tambos and their well-maintained paths, allowed the Inca army to move quickly and efficiently across their territory, ensuring that they could respond to rebellions or threats with a speed that was a major advantage over their enemies. The stone staircases and suspension bridges, while a marvel of engineering, were not just for show, they were a pragmatic solution to the problem of moving an army through a vertical landscape. The daily life on the road was one of quiet purpose. There was no bustling commercial traffic, no noise of carts or carriages. It was a silent, unceasing flow of people on a mission. The only sounds were the soft padding of sandals, the heavy breathing of the Chasques, and the occasional call of a llama train. The roads, for all their grandeur, were a part of a quiet, uncelebrated rhythm that kept the Inca Empire together. But what happened when a road system, built for a world without wheels, met a civilization that was defined by them? What was the fate of the Kapaknan when the Spanish arrived, and what did they see when they looked at this magnificent, alien network? The arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century brought a world defined by the wheel into contact with a world that had mastered the art of living without it. For the Inca, their roads were a source of strength, a system that allowed them to govern a vast and diverse empire. For the Spanish conquistadors, the Kapaknan was an alien and frustrating anachronism. They had horses and carts, but the Inca roads, with their steep stone staircases and narrow mountain paths, were impassable for their animals and vehicles. The Spanish were forced to dismount and proceed on foot, an indignity that was both a physical challenge and a symbolic one. The very system that had made the Incas so powerful was, for a time, a barrier to their conquest. However, the Spanish soon learned to use the Kapaknan for their own purposes. They didn't understand the complex, social contract of the MITA system, but they saw the roads as a valuable resource. They took over the tambos, turning them into military outposts and rest stations for their own forces. The very roads that had once been used to unify the Inca Empire were now used to conquer it. The Chasques, who had once carried messages of state, were now forced to serve the Spanish, their incredible speed and endurance now used to relay messages for their new masters. The ultimate fate of the Kapaknan was a slow, deliberate act of decay. The Spanish had no need for a massive network of footpaths. They wanted roads that could accommodate their carts and wagons. They began to build new, European-style roads, often paving over or ignoring the Inca paths. The communal maintenance system of the MITA was replaced by a brutal system of forced labor, and when the Spanish did not need a specific section of the road, it was simply abandoned. The intricate suspension bridges, once maintained by a meticulous system of weaving, rotted and fell apart. The great roads, which had been a testament to human resilience and ingenuity, were slowly reclaimed by the unforgiving forces of nature. Today, what remains of the Kapaknan is a series of fragmented trails and ruins. They are a haunting reminder of a world that existed on a different set of principles. The story of the Inca roads is a powerful reflection on the concept of progress. The Spanish, with their wheels and their iron tools, saw the Inca system as primitive. But the Inca had built a road network that was perfectly suited to their environment and their society. It was a system that worked in harmony with the natural world, not by trying to dominate it, but by adapting to its challenges. The legacy of the Kapaknan is not in its survival, but in the lessons it offers. It reminds us that there is more than one way to build a road, and that sometimes, the most sophisticated solutions are the ones that are the most simple and the most attuned to their environment. You are in a vast, sun-drenched hall filled with the quiet rustle of papyrus and the faint scent of oil. The year is around 250 BC, and you are in Alexandria, Egypt, the intellectual and cultural heart of the Hellenistic world. You are not among the philosophers or the kings, but with the librarians and archivists, the quiet, meticulous men who were the guardians of the greatest collection of knowledge the ancient world had ever seen, the Library of Alexandria. Their story is not one of dramatic political intrigue or grand discoveries, but of the boring, daily work that held a civilization's memory in its hands. The founding of the library was an ambitious project, a grand vision to collect a copy of every book in the known world. It was a project of immense scale and immense detail. The first task was acquisition. The Ptolemaic kings, who ruled Egypt, employed agents who traveled the known world, buying or borrowing scrolls. In one of the most famous examples of this meticulous acquisition, every ship that entered the harbor of Alexandria was searched. If a scroll was found, it was taken to the library, copied, and then the copy was returned to the owner while the original was kept. This process was a slow, deliberate act of intellectual accumulation, a testament to a society that valued knowledge above all else. Once a scroll arrived, the real work of the archivist began. The scrolls were not simply dumped into a room, they were catalogued with a level of detail that was unprecedented. The master librarian, the head of the library, oversaw a team of scribes and scholars. Their task was to organize the scrolls by author, subject, and genre. The most famous of these master librarians was Callimachus, a scholar who created a massive, 120-volume catalog called the Pinox. This catalog was a groundbreaking work of bibliographic classification. It was a slow, painstaking process of reading, summarizing, and indexing thousands of scrolls. The daily life of a librarian of Alexandria was one of quiet diligence. His work was a constant cycle of cleaning, repairing, and recataloguing. The papyrus scrolls were fragile and susceptible to insects, mold, and humidity. A librarian would spend his days in a kind of quiet meditation, unrolling a scroll, checking it for damage, and carefully making notes. The scrolls were often stored in small, wooden boxes, and each box had to be labeled with the name of the author and the title of the work. The work was repetitive, but it was essential. A single misplaced scroll could mean a lost piece of knowledge, a missing link in the chain of a civilization's memory. The librarians of Alexandria were not just passive guardians of knowledge, they were also active scholars. They would read, translate, and comment on the texts they were preserving. Their work was the very foundation of the intellectual life of the city. The library was a kind of ancient research institute, a place where scholars from all over the world would come to study, debate, and exchange ideas. The quiet, boring work of the archivist was what made this vibrant intellectual life possible. But what happened when this fragile repository of knowledge faced a threat not from natural decay, but from human folly? The tranquil, studious world of the Library of Alexandria was a hub of intellectual thought, but its very existence was a fragile anomaly in a world of political instability. The archivists and librarians, for all their dedication, were custodians of a physical collection that was vulnerable to fire, decay, and, most importantly, human conflict. Their daily work of cataloging and preserving scrolls was a silent race against time, but the greatest threat to the library did not come from a slow, natural process. It came from a series of historical events that would lead to its quiet and devastating decline. The first major blow was not a grand fire, but a military accident. In 48 BC, during a siege of Alexandria, Julius Caesar's forces set fire to a fleet of Egyptian ships in the harbor. The fire spread to the city, and a section of the library, specifically its warehouse or a nearby collection, was burned. The extent of the damage is still a matter of historical debate, but it was significant enough to be recorded by ancient historians. This was not a deliberate act of destruction against knowledge, but a tragic side effect of war. For the archivists, it was a profound trauma. Their meticulous work, their endless years of preservation, had been undone in a single, chaotic moment. The library did not disappear overnight. It was a slow, agonizing decay. After Caesar's fire, the library was partially rebuilt, but it never fully recovered. The political climate of the Roman Empire was not as conducive to intellectual patronage as the Ptolemaic dynasty had been. subsequent emperors and rulers were less interested in funding a vast collection of knowledge and more concerned with the practicalities of governance and military conquest. The daily funding for new acquisitions, for the salaries of the scribes and the archivists, began to dry up. The slow, methodical work of the librarians became harder and harder to sustain. The second great blow came from a new intellectual and spiritual movement, the rise of Christianity. In the late Roman Empire, as Christianity became the dominant religion, a new kind of intolerance emerged. The pagan texts and philosophies that were the heart of the library were viewed with suspicion, and in some cases, with outright hostility. In AD 391, Theophilus, the Patriarch of Alexandria, ordered the destruction of pagan temples, and it is believed that the last major collection of the library, the Serapeum, a temple complex that housed many of the library's scrolls, was destroyed or dispersed. This was a deliberate act of cultural and religious cleansing, a stark contrast to the accidental fire of Caesar's time. The final act of the library's quiet disappearance was one of simple neglect. Without a steady supply of new scrolls, without a community of dedicated scholars, and without the support of the ruling class, the library simply ceased to exist. The building and its contents slowly decayed, a victim of time, humidity, and the loss of its purpose. The story of the library's decline is not about a single grand fire that consumed everything. It is about the slow erosion of a tradition, a quiet death by 1,000 cuts. But what did the loss of this repository of knowledge truly mean for the future of civilization? The slow, quiet death of the Library of Alexandria was not a single, cataclysmic event but a long, drawn-out tragedy. Its loss was a profound blow to the intellectual life of the Western world, and the impact of its absence is still felt today. The most significant consequence was not the destruction of a single book, but the disruption of a system of knowledge. The library was more than just a collection of scrolls. It was a living, breathing network of scholars, archivists, and ideas. When the library declined, this network was severed, and the intellectual momentum it had generated was lost. The knowledge that was once concentrated in a single place was now scattered, forgotten, or simply left to decay. The loss was particularly devastating for the boring but crucial fields of science and mathematics. The library held a vast collection of astronomical observations, mathematical proofs, and medical treatises. Without a central repository and a community of scholars to build upon this work, progress in these fields slowed to a crawl. For example, the knowledge that the Earth was a sphere and its circumference could be calculated, which was known to ancient Greek scholars at the library, was lost to the Western world for centuries. This wasn't because the scrolls were burned, but because the system that preserved, propagated, and built upon that knowledge was gone. The Library of Alexandria was a kind of ancient search engine and academic journal, and its absence created a dark age of information. The enduring legacy of the Library of Alexandria is not just in its sad ending, but in the ideals it represented. It was a testament to the belief that knowledge should be collected, preserved, and made available to all. The quiet, repetitive work of its archivists was a form of heroism, a dedication to the idea that a civilization's memory is its most valuable asset. The library's story is a profound lesson in the fragility of knowledge and the importance of the mundane, uncelebrated work of preservation. Today, as we create new digital libraries and archives, we are, in a very real sense, continuing the work of those unsung archivists. We are engaged in the same quiet struggle against forgetting, a struggle that is as relevant today as it was in ancient Alexandria. You are in a smoky, bustling hall in a small English village in the year 1350. The air is filled with the smell of wood smoke, wet wool, and the rich, earthy aroma of brewing ale. The person at the center of this world is not a man, but a woman, the alewife. The story of medieval brewing is not one of large-scale commercial operations, but of a quiet, domestic art, performed almost exclusively by women. This is a tale of a boring, daily task that was a cornerstone of medieval life, and a vital source of nutrition and income for thousands of women across Europe. In the Middle Ages, water was often unsafe to drink due to contamination. Ale, a low-alcohol beverage made from fermented grain, was a safer and more nutritious alternative. It was a staple of the medieval diet, consumed by men, women, and even children from all walks of life. Because it was such a necessary part of daily life, almost every household brewed its own ale. This was not a hobby, it was a fundamental household chore, as essential as baking bread or mending clothes. The task of brewing fell to the woman of the house, who was often known as the alewife. The process was slow, deliberate, and physically demanding. The alewife would begin by milling the grain, often barley, by hand. She would then mash the grain with hot water in a large cauldron, a process that converted the starches into sugars. This sweet liquid, or wort, would then be boiled with a variety of herbs and spices, as hops were not yet widely used. The boiling was a critical step, as it purified the water and created a sterile base for the yeast. The wort was then cooled and transferred to a wooden barrel or vat, where the magical process of fermentation would begin. The alewife had no knowledge of microbiology, her understanding of fermentation was based on tradition and observation. She knew that a small amount of yeast from a previous batch, or simply wild yeast from the air, would transform the sweet wort into a bubbly, yeasty brew. The process was a mystery, a kind of domestic magic that she had to master. A good batch of ale was a sign of a skilled alewife, and a bad batch could make an entire family sick. The quality of her ale was a source of great pride and a key to her family's health and well-being. The alewife's work was not just for her own family. In many villages, she was also a small-scale entrepreneur. If she had a surplus, she would hang a large stick or a broom outside her door, a sign that her ale was for sale. This simple, quiet act was the beginning of a vast, decentralized brewing industry. The alewife was not just a brewer, she was also a shopkeeper, a businesswoman, and a key figure in her local economy. Her small, domestic enterprise was the very heart of the medieval beverage market. But what happened when this quiet, domestic art began to be replaced by a new, more commercialized form of brewing, and what was the subtle but powerful impact on the lives of women in the Middle Ages? The alewife's role was a quiet but essential part of the medieval economy and social structure. Her daily routine, a series of repetitive and physically demanding tasks, provided not just sustenance but also a source of social cohesion. The alehouse, which was often simply her own kitchen, was a communal space, a place where villagers could gather to share news, gossip, and a drink. The alewife was a central figure in her community, a kind of matriarch whose skill and hospitality were highly valued. Her social and economic power was derived directly from her ability to brew a good, consistent batch of ale. However, the art of the alewife faced a powerful new competitor, a change in the recipe. The introduction of hops to brewing began to change the industry forever. Hops, a flowering plant with a bitter, preservative quality, allowed brewers to create a more stable and longer-lasting product. This new, hopped beverage, which we would recognize as beer, could be brewed in larger batches and transported over longer distances. It was a more commercial product, and its rise coincided with the growth of towns and the emergence of a professional brewing class. This new, professional brewing industry was dominated by men. The large-scale production of hopped beer required a greater investment in equipment and a more commercial mindset than the small-scale, domestic brewing of the alewife. The men who entered this new trade were seen as skilled craftsmen, not just domestic providers. They began to form guilds, which were exclusive brotherhoods that controlled the trade and set standards. The alewife, who was often not a member of these guilds, found herself slowly but surely being pushed out of the industry she had once dominated. The shift was not immediate, it was a slow, boring process that unfolded over centuries. The alewife continued to brew, but her product, the unhopped ale, was seen as an old-fashioned, inferior beverage. The new hopped beer was a symbol of modernity, of progress, and of a more refined taste. The alewife, once a respected businesswoman, began to be viewed with suspicion. In a strange and unfortunate turn, her stick or broom, which had once been a symbol of her trade, became associated with the image of a witch. The round-bellied cauldron, a staple of her brewing, became a symbol of sorcery. The image of the alewife was subtly but profoundly transformed from a respected provider to a suspicious, marginalized figure. The decline of the alewife was a quiet but significant moment in history. It was a time when a powerful and essential female role in the economy was slowly usurped by a new, male-dominated industry. The story of medieval brewing is, therefore, not just about the evolution of a beverage, it is about the changing role of women in the economy and the slow, deliberate process by which a domestic art became a professional trade. But what was the final fate of the alewife, and what enduring cultural legacy did she leave behind? The decline of the alewife was a slow and quiet cultural shift. As brewing became a professional, male-dominated trade, the image of the woman brewer began to be subverted. The simple signs of her trade, the broom, the cauldron, the tall, pointed hat used to sell ale in a crowded market, were transformed into the visual tropes of the classic fairy tale witch. This was not a coincidence. The image of the alewife as a suspicious, solitary figure with a secret, powerful knowledge was a convenient way to sideline her from the new, male-dominated industry. Her domestic magic became a kind of dark art, a way of creating a narrative that made her role in society obsolete. The end of the alewife was a significant loss for women's economic independence. For centuries, brewing had been a reliable source of income for women from all social classes. It was a trade that could be practiced at home, allowing them to balance their domestic duties with a source of revenue. As brewing became commercialized, women were pushed out of the industry. Their work, once essential and celebrated, was now seen as a mere domestic chore. The economic power that came with brewing was now in the hands of men, and women lost a vital avenue for financial autonomy. However, the legacy of the alewife is far more enduring than her decline. Her story is a quiet but powerful reminder of the hidden history of women in the economy. She was a businesswoman, a purveyor of a vital product, and a key figure in her community. Her work, while boring and domestic, was the very foundation of the brewing industry. The modern breweries we see today, with their large-scale production and sophisticated marketing, are built on the foundations of her home kitchen and her humble cauldron. Her story is a quiet revolution that reminds us that progress is not always linear and that a change in technology or a shift in social norms can profoundly alter a person's role in history. You are in a vast, open landscape, a place of stark beauty and unrelenting sun. The year is 1868, and you are in the middle of the American West, a land of sagebrush and wide open sky. The air is thick with dust and the sounds of 1,000 men at work. This is the world of the Transcontinental Railroad, a monumental project that is often remembered for the grand pronouncements of politicians and the heroic actions of engineers. But the true story of this railroad is not one of dramatic feats. It is a story of the quiet, monotonous, and back-breaking work of the track layers, the thousands of anonymous men whose daily grind of a million small tasks laid the foundation for a new era. The men who built the railroad were not a single, unified group. They were a diverse army of laborers, a testament to the multicultural nature of American expansion. On the eastern side, the Union Pacific Railroad was built primarily by Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans. On the western side, the Central Pacific Railroad was built by tens of thousands of Chinese laborers. Their stories are different, but their daily routines were remarkably similar. Their lives were a cycle of grueling, repetitive tasks, a slow and steady rhythm that advanced the iron road a few feet at a time. The work began at dawn and ended at dusk. A team of men would work in unison, a kind of synchronized ballet of strength and endurance. The first step was grading the land. This was a brutal, physically demanding job, with men using pickaxes and shovels to level the ground and remove rocks. The second team would follow, laying down the wooden ties. These were heavy, rough-hewn timbers that had to be carefully spaced and perfectly aligned. The third team, the track layers, was the heart of the operation. They would carry the 56-pound iron rails, 2 men to a rail, and lay them down on the ties. The work was precise and fast. The men had to move in a coordinated rhythm, and a single mistake could lead to injury or delay. The final step was the most crucial, securing the rails. A team of men would follow the track layers, hammering in the heavy iron spikes that would hold the rails in place. This was a job that required immense strength and precision. The sound of 1,000 hammers striking iron was a constant, deafening roar across the plains, a kind of human percussion that announced the slow but steady arrival of progress. The work was not a matter of a single, great effort, but of 1,000 small ones, repeated day after day, week after week. It was a testament to the power of human endurance and the sheer force of collective labor. The lives of these men were defined by more than just work. They lived in temporary camps that followed the rail line, small, dusty villages that were a world unto themselves. The camps were a kind of rolling frontier town, with food vendors, gambling halls, and makeshift bars. But beneath the chaos and the occasional violence was a deep sense of community, a kind of shared purpose that came from a common goal. They were not just building a railroad, they were building a new way of life. But what happened when this quiet, uncelebrated army of workers faced the two most brutal obstacles in their path, and how did a simple tool make a world of difference?